Are you ready, Tom? Okay. My name is Robert Franklin. I'm conducting an oral history interview with Jim Buske on September 12th, 2018. The interview is being conducted on the campus of Washington State University Tri-Cities. Talking with Jim about his experiences at the Hanford Site. And for the record, can you state and spell your full name for us?
Okay, it's Jim Buske.
Buske, sorry.
Buske.
Okay.
And the address?
No address. And
okay.
is Jim short for James?
No.
Okay.
It's my given name is Jimmy.
Jimmy.
I-E.
Okay. Jim. J-I-M-M-I. J-I-M.
M-I-E.
Okay, great. So, Jim, tell me how you came to the area, to the Hanford site.
Well, Uncle Sam decided he needed me here. So that's how I got here. I was in the Army at the time, and I was due to be sent to Alaska. And I got as far as Fort Lewis, and come to find out they were so far ahead on sending the replacements up with the same job number that I had that they were just dividing us all up and sending all over the world, really. And I ended up, along with I think 5 other soldiers at that time, being sent to Camp Hanford, Washington.
Okay. Let's if you don't mind, let's back up a little bit. Tell me where and when were you born?
Oh, I was born in Stockton, Illinois, October 11th, 1934.
Okay. And when did you join the services? Or yeah. And were you drafted, or was it a
I volunteered.
Okay.
On November 29th, 1954.
Okay. Had you been to Washington before you came to Lewis and then came over to Camp Hanford?
No, never been to Washington.
What were your first impressions of Camp Hanford when you arrived?
Well, a whole lot different than it is in 2018. When I first got here, it was very hot and dry, and there was, if you didn't water something, it just didn't grow, and the population was way down from what it is today.
Mm-hmm.
Quite an area actually today. It's surprising, but vineyards and things like that were still somewhere in the future.
Where was Camp Hanford located?
Well, the camp itself?
Yeah.
Okay, the headquarters, and it was part of what they called 5th Group, which is about the size of a regiment, I think. But being Antiaircraft, which is our mission, we had groups instead of regiments, and brigades and batteries instead of companies. And I was in headquarters battery of the 83rd AAA battalion, Nike missile.
What was your job?
Well, I was, the Army told me I was a wheeled vehicle mechanic, but I knew better. When I got out to the permanent spot where I was stationed, I was assigned to a grease pit, just changing oil and greasing vehicles, and that's really about all I was capable of. But they thought I was a mechanic, so that's what they called me. And anyway, shortly after I got there, the dispatcher was assigned to motor sergeant school. So he left, and I became the dispatcher.
Like radio dispatcher? Or sorry,
no, it's a paperwork job where you kept track of maintenance and assigned vehicles to certain areas, and it was a fun job, really.
What was the purpose of Camp Hanford in the Nike missile program?
Excuse me. Well, it was, of course, Hanford in World War II in 1943, along with Oak Ridge, Tennessee, were the two main nuclear atomic energy development places in the country.
Mm-hmm.
And Hanford made plutonium for the A-bomb. It was one of the A-bomb types.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a real weird place because to this day, if someone says, "Where were you stationed?" and I say Camp Hanford, I just get a blank stare. Excuse me. It was just a hush-hush thing. When I got my orders to Camp Hanford, Washington, I thought they were talking about Washington, D.C., and being from Illinois, I thought, well, I'll get a delay en route and stop by home and see mom and dad and the siblings, and they put me on a Greyhound bus from Fort Lewis, and I went over the Cascade Mountains and right into Richland. That was it.
And how much did you know about Hanford when you? And how much did you learn about Hanford when you were stationed here?
Well, to begin with, I knew zero. And I found out that it was really a serious mission that they had. Uh, it sounds maybe grandiose, but we had a just an early warning board. They call it. It was a plexiglass outline of the whole West Coast, all the way from the Bering Sea and the Aleutian Islands, clear down to the border with Mexico. And we were the defenders, supposedly, of this whole area, along with several other Nike missile outfits. They were posted. There was one up in Seattle, I think, at that time, and others around that people didn't talk about them very much, but they had quite a serious duty to perform, and it was pretty hush hush. And
so your job was not just to protect the Hanford site, but to protect a much larger area.
Correct.
But you were stationed at the Hanford
Yes.
site.
Mm-hmm.
How long were you at Camp Hanford?
A little over 19 months.
19 months. What did you do for R&R?
Well, you probably have never heard of the Kennewick Highlands Dance Hall. But
a little bit. We have a little bit of about it in our archives.
Okay.
Yeah, it's gone now.
Yeah, when we would get a pass, which you could get every weekend if you didn't have duty, we'd come in from the forward area and actually right across the road from here, and maybe up or down a little bit, but there was a drive-in movie theater. And that was real popular then. Of course, they had their dollar for the carload nights, like most of the rest of them did. And but that was a very popular thing with the soldiers. And there was a few bars that were, I think, beer and wine bars that if you were over 18, you could get beer. And it was just really, we enjoyed getting acquainted with the local people. And they were very receptive to us. Primarily, the biggest share of them by far worked on the Hanford Works out in the same area that we were stationed in, But you just tried to blend in. as much as you could. And we never, to my knowledge, never caused any problem or created any trouble, and we were treated accordingly. The people took us in real well. We were grateful for that.
Yeah. Could you describe what a Nike missile site? What goes in? What kind of buildings are there? How big is it? How many men?
Well, okay. Typically, a battery, which is the equivalent of a company, is maybe 150 soldiers at a given site, and their primary mission was to maintain and operate the missiles in the event they were needed. So maintenance was performed, alerts were held constantly in headquarters battery. We did pretty near all the service work that was required, either vehicles or had all the personnel records and administrative duties. It was small enough to be a pretty close-knit group, and everybody knew their job and did it, and it was more or less almost like a 9-to-5 job, except you didn't go home at night. You just went to your barracks and sacked out, but our barracks were actually 12-man huts, prefab huts, which shortly after I got here, before I don't think I'd been here a week, and they had a pretty bad sandstorm. And the first morning I woke up and got out of my cot, and I stepped right into a sand dune that was on the floor right next to my cot. And luckily they never had too many of those sandstorms. But it was very, like I say, very hot and dry, and we were treated good. We didn't have a lot of harassing and things like that. It was almost like a 9-to-5 job, just about.
Yeah.
Except it didn't end at 5.
So there was the main headquarters, and then I assume there were sites.
Correct.
Around, and how many sites were there around, or missile sites around the Hanford site?
Okay, good question. We were headquarters, and we had actually 4 batteries, A, B, C, and D, and I don't know, maybe you've heard this, but D battery was the one that wasn't too far from where we sit right now. It was out on Rattlesnake Mountain. I think Highway 240 goes up by that way.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just, as you're going northwest, it would be off on your left-hand side. We were responsible for them, but I think actually they were probably over 50 miles away from headquarters, from our company. But you had, when you crossed on the ferry, crossed the Columbia, and went up the cliffside and started north, you went right past C Battery. And these were all probably around 150 soldiers per unit. Straight ahead was headquarters and part of A Battery, but that was just the launcher platoon part of it. The headquarters for A Battery was up further north towards the direction of Moses Lake, but not near that far, but up on Saddle Mountain. And they tried to put the radar units for each battery on high ground so they could cover a lot more sky.
Sure.
For defensive purposes.
Sure.
So the Saddle Mountain was a pretty high elevation, but they controlled the missile sites down at where we were. Then if you went further down the road, about maybe 20 miles, was B battery. And each one of those sites, if I remember right, had 4 missiles that were actually capable of being fired, which thankfully never were.
Yeah.
But anyway, we were really spread out.
Were you? Did you have cause to? Did you visit each one, or were you rotated through? Where were you stationed in respective of all those different batteries?
Well, in my particular situation, we were all in the battalion headquarters.
Okay.
So all the maintenance work came to us, and we were only capable of a real basic maintenance program. Otherwise, they came back to the rear to ordnance for overhauls and more complicated repairs.
And where would that be?
Well, I think if you're describing it from here, it would be on north on George Washington Way, and excuse me, you'd come in to the base camp, and the headquarters were just to the left of. You'd have to turn left off George Washington Way and then head north again, and the group headquarters was maybe a mile. From here, I would guess maybe around 3 or 4 miles away.
Mm.
That was the headquarters for the whole Hanford facility, really.
For the Army part of
yes.
The Nike missile sites. Were there any incidences or surprises while you were out here?
Militarily, or?
Yeah.
Well, there was one that was really sad. This headquarters of A battery was up on that Saddle Mountain, but it was just like 2/3 of the battery. The other third were with us down by battalion headquarters, and our mess hall supplied all the food to them up on the Saddle Mountain. So we had what they call the chow run, and as a dispatcher, I'd write out the paperwork and give them or assign them the vehicle, and they would haul the food up there on usually at noon, and it would have enough food for the noon meal and I guess maybe breakfast or something.
Mm.
And then in between, like for the third meal, they'd have cold cuts or something like that. But this chow run was every day about noon or shortly after. And the one noon, I wrote the guy up a trip ticket, and off he went. About half an hour later, we found out he had gone over the side and got killed.
Oh, wow.
I don't think they ever did really determine whether he was going too fast or he fell asleep, or anyway, there was no nothing underhanded about what happened. It was just an accident.
Sure.
The other one that comes to mind was more, looking back, it was more humorous than anything. They had in probably late summer of 1956, they had a nationwide, maybe global-wide, I don't know, operation called Operation Crackerjack. And it was SAC aircraft and the airplanes or whatever were trying to attack us like our enemies would do, and our mission was to theoretically not to allow that to happen, shoot them down or whatever. Of course, nobody fired anything live, but just before that, one of our leading officers was a strict believer in everybody should know everybody else's job and be capable of filling in when needed, blah, blah, blah. And so he had people like me and some other people from the motor pool doing radar work, which we knew nothing about. Well, anyway, we were in the main radar location, and I was assigned to the early warning board, and it had the whole coast with the Aleutian Islands and everything.
Oh.
And it was about maybe 3 feet wide and 5 feet tall or something like that, plexiglass. And I had to stand behind that with headphones on and listen to all this information being rattled in my ear, and I didn't catch most of it. And the ones that I did catch, I really didn't know for sure what they said, but they would give the coordinates of a bogey, and I was supposed to put an X on the board and then write backwards, because the duty officer up on what they called the bridge could see it then, from his direction it looked okay. But it was all totally confusing to me. And I wasn't alone. There were several others of us that really loused up bad. Well, anyway, the officer on the bridge, they called it, he was looking down there, and finally I remember he said, "Buske, what are you doing?" And I said, "Sir, I don't have any idea." So he said, "Well, you might as well come up here and sit with me then, because you're not doing any good down there." So the whole operation went, while I was on duty, I was watching with the officer in charge doing nothing really. And the actual, and I didn't know it at the time, but a plane flew right over us, and nobody knew who it was. And needless to say, that didn't bode well with the higher-ups and wherever they were.
Yeah.
And so I think it was about a week or two later, the orders came down from higher up that we were going to have this exercise again, and this time we would get it right. And everybody knew what that meant. If it happened again, heads were going to roll. So they held it again in about a month, and it worked like clockwork, supposedly. Nothing got within about 800 miles of us, and everybody did their job. They knew what to do, and they did it. But those two things, I remember that, especially that Operation Crackerjack, we just laughed about it because we knew it wasn't working well. Right. When people were looking up and saying, "What is that up there?" And I said, "Well, it's an airplane, but we don't know whose it is, whether it's ours or the enemy." That wasn't supposed to work that way. No. But anyway, it was mostly just a job, and you did what you were supposed to do, and tried not to be noticed, really. They always said if you were real successful, when you got out of the Army, one of your commanding officers was still saying, "Hey, you." He didn't know your name. And he said, if that was the case, then you were successful.
How long were you in the Army total?
Just 2 years.
Oh, 2 years. So Camp Banford then was the majority of your service.
Yeah, absolutely.
And when did you leave? Do you remember when you left?
When I left Hanford?
Yeah.
Well, it was November 28th, 1956.
And where did you go?
Back to Stockton, Illinois.
And what did you move on to?
For career?
Yeah.
Well, I got back home, and I had been a tool and die maker apprentice when I first went into the military. So I went back to work with the same company and finished my apprenticeship and became a journeyman tool and die maker, and ended up working for that same company for over 41 years.
Wow.
So it was good duty.
Yeah. Yeah, I bet. Let's see here. What of my standard questions for working at Hanford don't always apply here. So let me see what does fit in. What were the most challenging and rewarding aspects of your work here at Camp Banford?
Well, I think we tried to make light of what our responsibilities were, but I know that in my case and in almost everybody else that I knew, we were really concerned about what might happen and how to help us defend our country. And maybe it sounds hokey, but we really believed in what we were doing. We weren't out to cause trouble, but we didn't want it to happen to us either. Korea hadn't been over with all that long, and there were a lot of combat veterans in our ranks at that time, and they were really held in high regard because they had been through a lot more than we ever would, and we gave them credit for that. And I remember one of our staff car drivers was talking to me one morning, and I don't know how he even got started on it, but he told how they were overrun one night in Korea, and he pulled up his shirt and showed me, and he had a scar on his stomach in the front, and another one he turned around in the back where he'd been bayoneted in his sleeping bag, and the only way he survived was by playing dead. And, you know, when you hear things like that firsthand, you know, these are people that could very easily not be here, you know. Our motor sergeant was a real conscientious, very nice guy, World War II veteran. There was a lot of them in our outfit, too. And he told me one time about in Europe, he was right on the front line, and they were in a town I think in either France or Germany. Anyway, it was a lot of street fighting going on. And he got to a corner, and when he came to the corner, went around it, right on the other side was a German soldier, just like him. And each one went for their weapon, and he got his first, and he shot the other guy and killed him. And of course, they had to always search him for any valuable papers or anything like that. And he was telling us pretty matter-of-factly, and he said, you know, I found out that he was almost identical in age. He had a wife and the same number of kids, boys and girls, and he said it was just weird how we were the same, and it's just because I was just a little bit quicker. It was he that went down and not me. And I never forgot that. I thought how things turn out, you know, a lot of times it's just a reflex. Mm-hmm. And, you know, he wasn't real proud of what he had done, but he didn't have any choice. It was either him or me.
Right.
And anybody that had an experience like that has to be looked up to, I think. You know.
Yeah, I agree. What would you like future generations to know about working at Camp Hanford being in the Army during the Cold War?
Well, I think a lot of us wondered sometimes what the reason was for some of the orders that came down, and whether it was just to find a make work kind of a thing, or whether it was really serve a purpose. And we may have wondered and even doubted, but we did it anyway because we knew that we weren't the ones in charge. Somebody else was calling the shots, and when you were told to do something, you tried to do it.
Right.
I remember the first 4th of July I spent out there. There was 3 of us that had gotten there about the same time. And 4th of July in '55 was a pretty long weekend, like 3 or 4 days, and a holiday. And our motor officer, who was a crusty old warrant officer, and he was really a nice guy, but he liked to pick on new people. And he told us when he left to go back for home here in Richland for the weekend, that he'd like all the fence posts around the motor pool facility whitewashed by the time he got back. And there was an awful lot of fence posts that were kind of like railroad ties, so they had to be whitewashed on all 4 sides. And I remember it was beastly hot. And nobody else around to tell us that we had to do this, really. But he left the orders, so we did it. And when he got back at the end of the holiday weekend, he was almost aghast that we had gotten it all done. And it paid off supremely, because we were on real good terms with him after that for the rest of my duty. And that's how I made dispatcher of the battalion-sized motor pool. It's just good duty. He had things pretty much easy after that.
Yeah.
But I mean, we could have found a lot of ways and reasons why we didn't get it done, but we never thought about that. He gave us a job to do, and we did it.
Great. Well, Jim, is there anything else you wanted to say about your experiences at Camp Hanford?
Well, Robert, it's been a long time ago, and there aren't too many things that I can remember that the locals knew anything about, because, well, I guess I've just outlived them. But I remember how well we got along with the people here. And I didn't get involved too often with church, but it was every time I went, I was really welcomed, and we never took advantage of them, and they never chastised us. And I think they kind of realized that we were there for a reason, and it wasn't because that's where we necessarily wanted to be, but we were sent there, so you do the best you can with what you got.
Yeah. But
I think the area was really, it was quite an experience. And
in what way?
Well, you realize you have responsibilities, and you I guess you grow up a little bit, but you find out that getting away with something really doesn't solve much. It seems like it's always lurking there in the background somewhere, but I don't know. It was just a maturing deal. I got to play a lot of softball, and we played in the town league in 1956, and we won about as many as we lost. But it was a lot of fun meeting the locals on the ball field, and it was a good time.
Good. I do have one more question. When did you? So when you came out here, you just knew you were coming to a Camp Hanford. You weren't really sure, what it is you were going out to protect. When did you learn what was being made out at Hanford, and its connection to World War II and nuclear weapons?
Wow. Well, I for one was here a while before I realized that it was. Actually, I think the whole facility then was kind of under the rule of the AEC.
Mm-hmm.
And those people didn't fool around. We always recognized them because they were the suit and tie people, but they were the police that really had a lid on things. Mm-hmm. And they always said that we could have our civilian car out where I was stationed, but if you were in the car, like from our unit, we could drive over to Othello on that dirt track road. Mm-hmm. And they said, don't worry about if you have a breakdown, because you won't be there very long until somebody will show up. That they had the eye in the sky, airplanes flying around a lot, and as long as you were moving, they didn't pay much attention. But if your vehicle stopped, and I don't know this to be a fact, but they said you'd be noticed right away, and somebody would be out there wondering why you weren't moving. And so it was really kind of hush-hush, and it just kind of soaked in on you, I think, really how important it was what you were doing there. Pretty hard to put into words, but it was, you weren't in a foxhole, but you were still kind of on the front line.
Oh, I think that's a really great way of explaining it.
Well, thank you. This is a new experience for me.
It is for most people.
Yeah.
Jim, thank you for coming down and sharing your experiences out at Camp Hanford with us. We don't get a chance to interview too many people that were out there because so many people like yourself were stationed there and then moved away. Mm-hmm. And didn't come back. Unlike Hanford workers, many people came here, put down roots here. So
yeah,
appreciate your information. It'll really help us kind of reconstruct that camp, which was torn down decades ago.
Yeah,
and all those sites were decommissioned decades ago. So
one of the things that I did remember and the standard procedure was if you were going out George Washington Way to 5th Group headquarters and then went a little further to your left as you're going that direction, you hit the main road, which I think maybe turned into 240 now, and you went out maybe 3 miles, something like that, which was where the barricade was. And when we first were assigned here, we got a temporary barricade pass, just a piece of paper, really. But you got that while you were being processed, they called it. We heard that we were being checked on back in our hometowns, and were we subversive and blah, 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 And usually it took about a week or a little more, and you got this permanent card, like a driver's license, that sort of thing. But that was your barricade pass. And when you came in from the forward area, you were issued a barricade pass, your barricade pass, which is an ID card thing, at your own headquarters. And then when you got back in the rear, you turned that into a quartermaster or somebody, and he took your barricade pass and gave you bedding. So you could make your own bed up, and when you got ready to go back out into the forward area again, you turned in your bedding and you got your barricade pass back. They put you on a bus and you got out as far as the barricade, and an MP came on board the bus and checked everybody because your picture was on there and the whole thing. And if you didn't produce that barricade pass, you were put off the bus.
Yeah.
And like I say, it was about 3 miles out in the desert. And I never knew of anybody that it happened to, but they claimed that somebody got put off the bus right there. And you get back to headquarters the best way you can.
Mm-hmm.
But the situation really was, it didn't happen twice. But it was really kind of a procedure. And we found out later that we had been checked back home. I had certain people that would ask about your character, who are you, blah, 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 blah.
Right, interview friends and family and probably, even pastors and things like that.
It was a confidential clearance, they called it. It wasn't secret or anything like that. But it made you feel kind of a level above. You passed.
Right, like even a level above what the Army would have asked you for. Yeah. That's really interesting. Tom, did you have any questions?
We haven't heard a description of the installations. Said there were 4 missiles there. When were they installed? When were they removed? And what were they like?
Yeah.
You mentioned doors open.
Could you describe the installations? What you know about the missiles when they were there and what they were like. Shape and size and things.
Well, actually, everything was there before I got here, but each battery had 4 of these in-ground launchers, they called them, and they'd point them straight up in the air when they were fully operational. Actually, I never got down into below ground where the missiles were. There were 4 launchers per battery. So if you figure with the 4 batteries, there's 16 that were ready to go at any one time. And I remember seeing a TO&E, or table of operation and equipment, for the whole battalion. And they said at one time we had over 100 Nike missiles capable of fire, reload. I don't know how long it took to reload, but it had to have been pretty fast. But I didn't know much about any of that stuff when I got here. I didn't know much more after I left.
I know before the Nike missiles there were anti-aircraft emplacements. Were those still in operation when you got here?
Yes, they were.
And was that was also part of the larger Camp Hanford?
That's right. That's a good point. There were at least 3 120 millimeter gun battalions, and each one of those had different batteries of anti-aircraft capability. They would go down to, I think, White Sands, New Mexico, or someplace for training. They would take their guns down there, and they were huge, by the way. 120 millimeter gun is a large weapon.
Yeah.
And they would bring them back and then set them up and fire them to settle them in, they called it, to make sure that all their readings were correct and everything. And when they fired them, we could hear them, and you could almost count to 10, and way up there somewhere, all of a sudden you'd see a little puff of black smoke like the flak, And I'll tell you, it was up there a long ways.
Wow.
120 millimeter could really get up there in altitude. Not as high as we could with our Nike, but they had a job to do too.
But they actually got to fire theirs off, though.
Yeah. It was exciting for us because we never got to fire our weapons.
Well, that's probably for the best.
Yeah, that's right. The overall is pretty good.
Yeah.
But it was real good duty because, like I say, it was small, and you knew the mess sergeant, and he knew you. And
is this the first time you've been back to this area since you left in '56?
No, actually, it's the second.
Okay.
The first time we actually went, it was before the state highway went through or anything, but we got out to where the headquarters were, and the way I could tell it was, one thing that never changes out there is the horizon.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I could look, and I could remember seeing what the horizon looked like from a certain spot. And I found a spot, and it also had a few trees around it, which is kind of unusual too. And I thought, well, boy, no way to really tell for sure, but I think this is where the motor pool was. And I got to looking around, and everything just, you get that kind of a weird feeling, you know. And wife was standing there, and I said, I really get a feeling about this, and I'm going to pull some sand here a little bit and see if what I think is there. And I dug down in the sand, maybe 6 or 8 inches, something like that. And I came to a concrete curb that was yellow on the top. And it was the top curb of my grease pit that I worked in. And I had probably painted the top of that curb with yellow paint. And this was probably, at least 15, 20 years after I was there.
Oh, wow.
But, a funny thing, maybe as a final, but when I was in that grease pit, like I say, the Army said I was a mechanic, but I knew better. And I had a good buddy that had a truck. It was a civilian-type truck, but it was a supply truck or something. And he and I were talking one day, and he said, my windshield wipers are not operating right. Do you suppose you could fix them? And I said, well, yeah, it's kind of a challenge. Sure, we'll have a look. And they were vacuum wiper blades, so it can't be too complicated, you know. So he said, well, when can you do it? And I said, well, it's getting late afternoon. I'm not busy. Let's take it in there and have a look. See, he drove it in and got it running, and I started pulling hoses off to see if that was where the problem was. The vacuum part was leaking or whatever, you know. Well, anyway, I probably pulled off more hoses than I should, and when I replaced them, I didn't replace them. Well, anyway, it got so bad the truck wouldn't even run. But this time it's quitting time, and our motor officer, this crusty old warrant officer, had a fetish about emptying out the building every evening so that it shows everything was done.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we had to push it out and push it back onto the deadline, and next morning we came in, and I went to one of the mechanics that was a real mechanic, and he was a good friend, and I told him what had happened. I said, you suppose you could help me out? He said, I don't see any problem there. So he goes over and he starts monkeying around, and the truck would run, and he replaced this and that and the other, and it didn't take him 10 minutes, and he had it running like a charm, and the wipers were running like they should. And I said, well, that's great, thanks a lot, and off he went. And it must have been a good week later. I was down in the grease pit, and all of a sudden I could hear this cackling and giggling and tee-heeing, and I remember looking up out of my grease pit, and all I could see was legs outside the door, and there were quite a few pair of legs out there. So I thought, I don't know what's going on, but I came up out of the pit and walked out and looked, and they're all standing out there by my door looking up and just laughing and giggling. And So I went out there, and here's the warrant officer and the motor sergeant, and they're all looking up there. And I looked, and the sign painter for our unit, who was pretty good at what he did, painted this nice, real big sign up there over my door. It says, Buske's Bay. Drive them in, tow them out. Everybody was getting a kick out of that, so you can't fight it. I started laughing, too. From there on, I really got along well with everybody. It was a nice experience. I kept telling them I am not a mechanic. They said I was, but I know better. That was a funny experience.
That was funny. Anything else, Tom? Okay. Well, Jim, thank you so much for taking the time to come and sit down with us.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity. When you mentioned this, it pleased me to be able to have a bit of nostalgia with you.
Oh, good.
It's fun to be able to reminisce.
Good. Okay. Well.